Hello, hello. And according to the live stream feed here, we should be live right now. And I'm just going to make sure that the sound and everything is all good. Very well. All right. Hey, everybody. Happy that you are joining me here today. If you're here live or coming on live as we get going here, I know this was a little sudden. I just created the show a couple hours ago. And here we are. Little bonus live stream for your Wednesday. I have some things, in fact, quite a few things prepared to go over with you today about the subject of children in the Church of Scientology. And we're going to take a big meta look at this. This is not going to be a 5-minute show. I've actually got a whole little PowerPoint prepared because I was actually happily surprised to see AI finally do something useful for me in putting a bit of a slideshow together. I was putting together I have a very large digital archive of Scientology materials and other cult stuff too. I got books and magazine articles and academic papers, and with Scientology, there's such an incredible wealth of stuff. There's thousands of lectures, that are MP3 files and videos, which I've got, burned as discs, and so many books and so many PDFs of materials. And I was going through all of that, putting together the various things in the C organization from the public level, in the books, in the lectures about children. I got really curious about this because the Church of Scientology recently has been noisily active on promoting to and trying to generate excitement about children doing Scientology. And of course, this is the most offensive thing that Scientology does, as far as I'm concerned, and I think as far as a lot of you are, when it comes to extending its cult claws out into the world. Going after kids is the lowest of the low, because children are defenseless in a lot of ways. They have not yet fully grown or established a brain or critical thinking skills or even all the cognitive functions that are required in order to navigate life. This is what growing up is all about. It's not that there's something wrong with children that this is this way. This is just how children are by their nature. And they are incredibly inquisitive and incredibly trusting, and they will accept information from all quarters and take it in and run with it. Now let's go ahead and switch over here real fast over to the chat box screen, just so we have those on there. As I'm monologuing a bit, and before we get into our actual presentation here, I need to stress how important it is to me as somebody who has studied not only Scientology but destructive cults of all kinds, and has interviewed hundreds of survivors, many of whom grew up in evangelical or some other religious household and had that religion forced on them. And not only the beliefs or ideas of the religion forced on them, but that they were actually physically abused in the process through disciplinary measures, through hours and hours of biblical, scriptural learning. Scientologists do this too, by the way. It's not just something that Christians do. Of course, this happens in Islam. Of course, this happens in Judaism. There is no religion that doesn't abuse their kids. You can find plenty and plenty of examples of this. And I find that behavior to be the most egregious. So I thought that in light of Scientology's recent noise-making and excitement about getting kids on board, I thought we should take a good hard look at the history of children in the Church of Scientology and what they've been about with kids from the very beginning. Because Scientology has actually morphed and changed over the years, and I think through the course of this you're going to see exactly what I'm talking about. They were never in a place where they had it right and they were dealing with children well. And yet they've gone through these different phases that have all been pretty awful. I'm going to... just thinking about which screen. Yeah, let's just switch over to our slideshow screen now. And this, again, these slides are, I'm going to fully acknowledge these slides are the product of Notebook LM. I even got the little watermark down there in the bottom corner, based on information that I was feeding it from my library of Scientology information. And I had a lot of sources pile in on this and kind of go through the timeline of how Scientology has dealt with kids. There are a lot of L. Ron Hubbard quotes and orders and directives. This was not something Hubbard paid no attention to. Actually, right from 1950, with the publication of Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, with that book coming out and the lecture tours and promotional work that Hubbard would do, kids came up real early. How do we take Dianetics principles and apply them to children? Yeah, people were doing that right away. And what we have, if you look over the timeline here of this cover here, is the immortal child, right? This idea that from 1950 to now, we have shifting dogmas, strategic pivots, and deep internal contradictions. And that's really what this presentation today is about. Now, first off, this is an interesting slide. This is actually about L. Ron Hubbard himself, the architect matrix, meaning the architect of Dianetics and Scientology. And Hubbard, if you go back to the beginning of Dianetics and Scientology and read how L. Ron Hubbard talked about himself, how he was described, the credentials that he claimed to have, which he absolutely did not earn and never had, or got through, chicanery and conning people, like the doctorate degree that he had, which was just a straight out of a diploma mill. Hubbard claimed that he was a nuclear physicist, a civil engineer, and a pioneering medical researcher. He actually did put out written publications claiming these titles. He said that Dianetics was the first major breakthrough by the exact sciences in the field of the humanities. In other words, Dianetics was the very first progress that had ever been made in the humanities. Ever. He routinely trashed psychology, psychiatry, history, ethnology, anthropology, any of the other social sciences, as well as created an actual hate campaign against the field of psychiatry as a whole. And there is nothing, repeat, nothing that psychology or psychiatry can do that Scientology will agree with or acknowledge as factual or true. From time to time over the years of Scientology's existence, they have played nice with psychology in some ways and have tried to align or become adjacent to certain psychological principles or fads or practices in the culture. But internally, Scientology has nothing but contempt for anything having to do with mental health or the field of mental awareness. They do not acknowledge or agree that any other field really has anything figured out of any importance except for Scientology. And of course, Hubbard's mental state was a genius holding the singular solution to humanity's survival, right? This was all the presentation. This is the constructed persona of Hubbard. The reality is that he is unaccredited degree from Sequoia University. He failed to demonstrate even a basic knowledge of physics or medicine. And this is obvious in Hubbard's lectures and in his written works. The man was foolishly ignorant and loudly and confidently so. He built his entire subject on subjective hallucinations. There is no laboratory, no clinical trials, no objective evidence for Dianetics as a science. There is nothing. There are no case histories. There are no peer-reviewed blind control studies. Nothing like that was ever allowed to be done or done by Hubbard or his enablers. And of course, Hubbard's own mental state was evaluated to be exhibiting symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia with delusions of grandeur. So L. Ron Hubbard himself was quite a piece of work. And this is the man who is going to be advising us on how to deal with children. So let's take a look at the things that he had to say about that. Now, let me just check in here real fast with you all, make sure we're all good. I will do that from time to time. And following on here, we have the Utopian promise from 1950 of Dianetics, which within 2 years, by 1953, had become the Church of Scientology. As at the beginning, it was still this mental science without any science in it. And Hubbard used a lot of very flowery language to convince people that he was really on the up and up and he had nothing but the good of mankind in his mind, when in fact he had nothing but money and fame and influence on his mind, and he really got off on controlling people. The goal of Dianetics is a world without insanity, without criminals, and without war. It provides an understanding of life, man, and mind operation, which could resolve the 19 million insane, our millions of criminals, and international madness, Hubbard said. But when you come up to the Anderson report from Victoria, Australia in 1965, you get quotes out of the government 15 years after Hubbard is talking about saving the world. Their conclusions after reviewing all and very thoroughly reviewing all of Scientology's practices and methods and up to 1965, their conclusion was that Scientology is evil. Its techniques evil, its practice a serious threat to the community, medically, morally, and socially, and its adherents sadly deluded and often mentally ill. That's a harsh statement to see in a government report. But that was what they found Scientology to be. Now we look here, I mentioned about this shifting sort of pendulum of attitudes and ideas about kids. And this sort of arc here gives you a bit of the lay of the land that we're going to be covering. Starting with 1950s, you have a radical permissiveness being asserted and lectured on by Hubbard and by his Dianetics Research Foundation staff, who are taking his lectures and his books, his written materials, his notes, and are compiling books and materials, starting with a book called Child Dianetics, which was a compilation book put together by the Research Foundation. And the attitude about kids at this time is that they should be shielded. They are fragile entities, and they have all this potential and all this self-determinism, Hubbard says, and all of this ability, but they are little, fragile, defenseless creatures. And in the womb, he even talks about in Dianetics how you can have memories of time going all the way back to prenatal memories, which is patently ridiculous. There is absolutely no credible way for a human being to form memories that young. Literally, the brain tissue and the matter that creates and runs memory doesn't exist, or is still forming, and it's just not possible to have the things that Hubbard claimed to be true. They just can't be true. But that didn't stop him from doing so, right? But as time marched on, and as Hubbard went into other places and Scientology grew, and he had other things to say about kids and about education, they changed the tune, and kids became ancient immortal spirits who needed discipline. And finally, we come up to the more recent time period where there is basically an institutional rejection of children. This is especially manifested internally in the C organization, Scientology's internal sort of fanatical group of Hubbard's most serious followers sign a billion-year contract of commitment to dedicate their entire life to Scientology. And they were doing so since it started in, the Sea Org started in 1967. And some of those people had kids, and those kids were around. And things happened. Not really great things. We're going to talk about that in some detail. So Scientology's relationship with kids basically here is defined not by any kind of dogmatic or theological consistency. There's no religious, if these are religious scriptures, they have changed with the times. They really follow whatever strategy best serves Hubbard in the moment and at that time. And so we have these changing trajectories of how children basically are dealt with. So let's take a look at how this breaks down. Actually, we can look at these broad shifts, and we can actually look at it in four eras here. So you have your era of radical permissiveness, and the child is a sensitive recording device who is taking in everything, and it's all going into their awful, evil, reactive mind, the part of the mind that Hubbard said is where bad things are stored and they come back at you. The mind serves it up subconsciously later to hurt you or stop you from doing what it is you want to be doing. So Hubbard positioned children at this early stage as very, very helpless and very, very needing of care and attention. But at the same time, they need to be left alone to grow into their own self-determinism. You have to keep your hands off their stuff. If they want to mess with their things, if they want to have, a messy body or whatever, you're supposed to let them have that. By the 57 to 66 time period, we have the introduction of the Thetan and this sort of aggressive work on the part of Scientology and Scientologists to infiltrate schools, especially public schools. You're not going to believe what's going to come up on that. Children were a vehicle for Scientology promotion. When the Sea Org comes along, you have a severe discipline problem because L. Ron Hubbard hated kids and didn't deal well with them institutionally or organizationally. And then in the present time, since Hubbard's death, there's a sort of forced family rejection within the Sea Organization or within Scientology in a way, but mainly within the Sea Org. While at the same time, they've kind of pivoted to this weird cartoonish sort of reality of kids. It's interesting stuff. So let's take a look at this from the very beginning and just break it down relatively quickly. We've covered already that Scientology starts with dianetics, and dianetics is about making your mind more efficient and able, right? And trying to get you to a state of clear where you no longer are inhibited by this portion of your mind called the reactive mind. All of this, pure fantasy. This is just stuff Hubbard made up for a book. He didn't do any research. He didn't do any science. He didn't do any studies. And he didn't let anybody else do it either. Every time anybody ever made any efforts or noises in his direction about validating or actually doing science about his stuff, he would shut it down and call people who tried con men or people who were trying to suppress mankind and his Hubbard's altruistic efforts to save and salvage mankind. Right? This was Hubbard's attitude: is if you're either with me or you're against me. Very, very clear. So, preventative dianetics. What is the idea here? Well, there's a foundation. This idea in Scientology, you may have heard, that children are adults in little bodies. This actually comes straight out of this foundational axiom, 1951. A child is a man or a woman who has not attained full growth. A child is a man or a woman. A child is not a child. Right? This is the concept right from the get-go of children are adults, fully realized, fully matured spiritual entities in a body. Now, with dianetics, they are viewed, as it says here, right? You have this idea of silence around kids who are hurt. At birth, you're supposed to be quiet. You're not supposed to feed this reactive mind with any ideas or with any content, and sound and pictures and, sight, sound, all your perceptions are being recorded in your reactive mind, according to L. Ron Hubbard, and they will come back as trauma later on. So if you shut down and make everything quiet, and then there's nothing to record. And so there's nothing to come back at you later, is the idea. And this was basically dogma within the Scientology group, within Dianetics and Scientology, for the first few years that they were around. Okay. And this idea of radical permissiveness, right? It's none of your business. L. Ron Hubbard's official mandate regarding intervention if a child smashes their own possessions, rooted in the belief in a child's enormous self-determinism, right? Hubbard says that this is a being who has recently died. This child in front of you. This is somebody who lost their body. And now here they are manifesting a new life in a new body, and they have to get acclimated to it and figure it out. And the last thing they need is adults around them ordering them about, hurting them, abusing them, or doing bad things to them. And sure enough, children shouldn't be abused no matter why you think you shouldn't be abusing kids. You shouldn't be abusing them. But this permissiveness was an awful lot of leave the kid alone and they'll be fine. If you interfere almost not at all, in other words, basically be absent as a parent, right? It's not about encouraging independence. For Hubbard, the way this manifested was absenteeism. You just weren't even around much for the kids. And that's not a good way to raise your kids, because children absolutely positively need not just role models, but they need care, and they need to know that they will be cared for. And when they don't trust their caregivers, which can be established very early on in their life by absenteeism and neglect and abuse, then you have kids who are being set up for failure before they've even learned how to talk. So Hubbard's advice on this is just an adult who just died and is now in a little tiny body is ludicrous for a number of reasons, not just for the belief, but because of what they do with the belief in Scientology. And of course, this is the time when he's also targeting education. There was even a thing called educational dianetics, where Hubbard was trying to use dianetics to get into the field of education. He thought that it had applicability there. And in 1955, there was an experiment done. There was a study done, not by Hubbard, but by a couple of Scientologists, called the Creative Learning Experiment. Don't know if y'all ever heard about this. We're going to go into some detail on it. This was conducted by Victor Silcox and Len Maynard. Now, this is not an actual picture of these guys, but it was two guys who were really, really interested in getting Scientology into schools. And they wanted to do so. This is 1955. If you're familiar with Scientology and you know about study tech and you know about, how kids are being taught how to study, and that's the big education thing, this is all before that. There was no study tech in 1955. There were just Scientology processes. And there was a specific kind of processing, which was called creative processing. John Atack has said numerous times that L. Ron Hubbard cribbed this almost directly from Aleister Crowley's work, which is an occult practice, if I remember right. And regardless, creative processing is something that is, we'll get into it. But the idea here is to test whether these creative processing techniques, and they really did do this, could be successfully applied to a classroom environment. They wanted to increase ability, and this is a phrase, by the way, this increasing ability. This is a very generic phrase that sounds great, but really doesn't mean anything. What does it mean, increase ability? To do what? How? Where? Why? It's a very broad statement. It's not very scientific, in other words. How do you measure I increased ability? Yes, I have increased ability. Oh, really? Would you like to measure that somehow? Right? Anyway, they did try to measure this through raised IQ scores and academic performance. And here's what happened during the study itself. This is where we get into the mocking up of things, the creative processing steps, right? You have the idea in Scientology is that you are an immortal spiritual being. A Thetan is the word for that in Scientology. Ironically rhymes with Satan. Some people have said that's not a coincidence, right? I'm not suggesting that Hubbard is demonic. I just think it's kind of funny. Because later Hubbard claimed to be Lucifer. Anyway, you have these mental image pictures. This is when you close your eyes and you see a cat. Hubbard claims that that picture that you see in your mental mind, with your mental eye, close your eyes, you see the picture, you can hear the cat maybe, right? Internally inside your head, you can hear that. Those are called mental image pictures in Scientology. And they don't just have to be visual. All the senses are represented in these mental image pictures. And children are instructed to close their eyes and imagine fantastic things that could not happen, incorporating sight, smell, and touch. They are sent on a sensory imagination trip. That's what creative processing basically is, and how it is done with these children. As they were sent for a period of time, they were told to mock up these pictures, mental image pictures, mock up ideas or generate images of various things, right? We'll go over some of what those things were in a second. The goal here is exercising control of the physical body through enforced imagination. The idea is that it's not just taking you on a joyride of the mind, or creative processing is not about tuning up your imagination. It's about weirder things. It's about establishing more control in your environment and establishing more certainty for yourself over what's real and not, and somehow raising your ability as a Thetan to create things, or alternately destroy them, because you're creating mental image pictures and destroying them through the process of creative processing. This is not something that is practiced now as such in Scientology. Scientology has a lot of techniques in it, and a lot of stuff they do, which they call auditing. And creative processing was one kind of auditing that used to be done. It has since basically been replaced by a lot of other kinds of auditing, most of which is just as destructive or worse than creative processing. So the idea here was to take backward, it wasn't just any kids, it was to take backwards remedial kids, junior school, 7 to 11. Over a 5-week pilot period, they would do these 20-minute sessions of creative processing with the kids. And this was going to replace their grammar lessons. Okay, so we had some other things happening here too. It wasn't all just creative processing. There was a compliance drill, stand up, sit down. It was basically what they call in Scientology group processing, where you basically give simple physical commands to an audience or group of people. In this case, kids, 7 to 12, remedial nature, right, in junior school. Stand up, sit down, that kind of thing, right? It's rare. There's nothing particularly harmful about that particular thing, except for the fact that the entire intention of that is to get these kids under control. And in Scientology, control is defined as the ability to start, change, and stop something. If you can start and change and stop a thing, you control it. And so the idea was to get these kids under control with the compliance drill. Then they would do these communication drills, and this was not TRs. They weren't sitting the kids down and having them look at each other for minutes or hours. Instead, they had the teacher and the students would exchange hello and all right. This is called hello and okay in Scientology. It's a Scientology auditing process, and it's done over and over and over and over and over again for 10 to 20 minutes with a bunch of kids. Hello, all right. Hello, all right. Hello, all right. I mean, can you imagine doing that for 10 or 20 minutes? This is called trance induction. It's hypnotic. It's a way of putting people into trance states through monotonous repetition. And then you have, by session 5, you're having these sensory recall experiences. Remember real experiences of affinity, reality, and communication. In Scientology, this is called straight wire. It's a memory process. And the idea is that you recall a time that was really real to you. Recall a time you were in really good communication. And then I think recall a time you really liked someone. I think are the commands based around affinity, reality, and communication. So kids would be sent down memory lane to remember these times of, fairly pleasant stuff. Nothing particularly traumatizing or awful about remembering times you were in good communication with someone. The idea is that this is supposed to tune up your memory by practicing remembering good times. And then finally, we get to the nasty at the end of this, which was session 7, the death lessons. This is where the creative processing came into play. Children were commanded to mock up failing all your exams, dying because you did, seeing bodies going to dust, and finally pulling the dust into yourself. And all of that is very standard, very typical creative processing commands that Hubbard would have adults do to deal with existential issues or deal with the reality of the physical universe versus their reality as a spiritual being. This is very faith-based, spiritual kind of stuff, which Hubbard says is real. This is the energy you're manifesting while you're doing the creative processing, and the pictures you're coming up with, and the creating them and destroying them, and all of this. This is supposed to have deep spiritual significance, and is supposed to result in people having superpowered abilities following doing this creative processing. So these guys thought, well, what happens if we do it to kids? What happens if we have children mock up dying? What happens if we have children going to dust and pulling the dust into themselves? Well, these are children. They're not up to dealing with existential issues. They don't sit around thinking about dying. So the initial report's conclusions, this is according to the researchers themselves in their own report. They said that they got reading gains and improvements, and that there were IQ score raises. And this is back in the 50s, when apparently it was, according to L. Ron Hubbard at least, very controversial and very disagreeable to think that IQ could be something that would change. IQ was supposed to be, I guess, a number that stayed the same. This is according, again, to L. Ron Hubbard. I don't think that's actually what psychology thought, but that's what Hubbard said they thought. And these guys set out to prove that that was wrong by giving IQ tests to these kids before and after these processing sessions. Now, here's where things got crazy, is somebody took the creative learning experiment, another woman, and ran with it in a real public school. This was Aston House Prep School in East Grinstead. Miss Sheila Hode, the headmistress of this school, utilized the creative learning manual. Exercises were expanded to highly vulnerable pupils ages 3.5 to 11. Sessions, including the traumatic death lessons, were conducted strictly behind locked doors bearing do not disturb signs, right? There were no adults present. There were no parents around when they were doing all of this stuff. And there were consequences. A 9-year-old boy developed severe depression directly linked to getting these sessions. The mother forced to remove the child from school and seek immediate medical intervention from a doctor. And another young female pupil expressed a sudden, overwhelming, and terrifying fear of dying to her mother following exposure to session 7. So there were some emotional, psychological impacts that alarmed parents to such a degree. In 1960, East Grinstead, we're out of here. Pulling my kids out of this school. This is crazy. This is nuts. What are you doing to my kids? Having them sitting around imagining death, imagining themselves dying, imagining their friends dying all around them. What the hell is wrong with you people, right? Dr. Thompson should leave my daughter alone and inject his cucumbers when he thinks they are in pain, is what one parent had to say, reflecting on this whole thing. So the outraged parents pulled the children. She had to resign in disgrace, and they actually closed the Aston House prep school, and that's where creative learning actually took things in the real world. So you take Scientology and you listen to L. Ron Hubbard, and it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. These two science-y kind of guys take L. Ron Hubbard at his word, go, let's do this to kids. Here's what happened. Not a good look. And in fact, Scientology did not like that at all. They disavowed the whole thing. Nope. We didn't. Nope. That's old. That's not modern Scientology. They shouldn't have been doing that. Has nothing to do with us, right? Whereas, of course, Scientology would have been all too happy to take full responsibility for it had there been anything positive that came out of that. But because it was a public flap and controversy and massive problem and PR debacle, Scientology didn't want to have anything to do with it. So then we have this shift, right? From the developing mind over to the immortal Thetan, who's tough and knows what to do in all circumstances, right? And this is the adults. It says with less bodies. Should have said with little bodies there. And Hubbard starts getting a bit tougher about kids. Now, Hubbard himself had kids, and when he was around them at all, it was mostly for photo opportunities. He was mostly an absent father, as I understand it. But he advised that during the 1950s, it changed from this Scientology sort of light approach to children need to be audited at tone 40, he said. It was just direct, unreasonable commands. Tone 40 is where you don't even listen to the person. You just demand they comply with what you're telling them to do, and you don't care what they have to say about it. And we have this. Now, this comes out of around the same time period, 1950s, 1960s. We have L. Ron Hubbard putting a plan together for how to get Scientology into the schools. This is separate from the creative learning experiment and Sheila Hode taken off with that. Entirely separate from that, Hubbard had a whole other thing that he advised. The teenage monster strategy. And this was described specifically by Paulette Cooper in her 1971 book, The Scandal of Scientology. And what was advised is to exploit public anxieties about youth to force Scientology methodologies into the public education system. Hubbard wanted schools using Scientology. And he thought, here's how to get them to do it. We will promote, we will find, and we will make a great big controversial problem out of juvenile delinquency and childhood sexual assault. And the fact that this is happening at these schools. And something must be done. And these children need to be helped. And these institutions are madhouses of insanity and chaos where children are being sexually assaulted. And he thought this was a great way to get in there. Seriously. And so they were going to position science, they were going to create this big controversy out of how children were being assaulted. And then they were going to position Scientology as the mental consultants and the only viable solution to dealing with this problem in the high schools. It was going to be a leverage point. Hubbard thought he could basically blackmail or push these schools into allowing Scientologists into them to deal with the kids, right? Well, this didn't go anywhere, but this teenage monsters plan was, according to Paulette Cooper, a real thing, and Hubbard advised doing it. Don't even have words at a certain point. Who strategizes that? Who goes, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make schools out to be so crazy and the people running them so off the rails and so ill-advised on how to handle anything with kids that they're going to demand we come in and help those children out. What? How? Who? That's L. Ron Hubbard. That's exactly how he thought they would get Scientology into the schools. Don't even have words. So by 1967, you have the Sea Organization come into existence. And by this point, there are lots and lots of great, great books and material out there about L. Ron Hubbard's mental state and decline over the years that Dianetics and Scientology existed. And by 1967, it can be said pretty safely that L. Ron Hubbard was, I would believe it would be safe to say, I'm not a clinician, so maybe I shouldn't say it this way, but I believe it would be safe to say that he was clinically paranoid. He was certainly paranoid, whether to a pathological, clinical degree, I'm not qualified to say. But he was absolutely convinced that every government in the world was against him and against Scientology. And he was telling his followers constantly that it was because the governments of the world wanted to suppress Scientology out of existence. They wanted to destroy it because it was the only thing that was bringing freedom to mankind. It was the only thing that could bring freedom to mankind. So by 1967, Hubbard had made a very, very clear line in the sand in terms of you're with us or you are against us. And every government was against Hubbard as far as he was concerned. So they lost their tax-exempt status in America in 1967. They were on the edge of being banned in the UK and had active legal efforts being taken against them in Australia, which led to a ban which was later overturned by the Australian Supreme Court. I say all of this so that it's clear that when Hubbard started the Sea Organization, he was not in a good place. And he was building a little army of the loyalist followers he had, and he took them out to the ocean on boats so that they could be safe from the authorities and free to research the upper levels of Scientology and bring freedom to mankind. This is what L. Ron Hubbard's followers actually thought was happening when they were out on those boats. And that's why those same followers brought their kids. Not all of them had kids, but those who did, there were kids around. And Hubbard had to deal with the fact that he not only had these most loyalist of loyal followers, but that they had kids. And kids were going to be around on these boats. And what to do, right? How to deal with this. And his attitude was not one of kindness and compassion and care. Hubbard became paranoid to a degree that these kids were a bother, a problem, and even counter to what the Sea Organization was all about. So what he did was he took the youngest of these kids, 11-year-olds, 10, 11, 12-year-olds, and he made them his personal staff. He made them his messengers. And their job was to become a clone of L. Ron Hubbard. Hubbard already had said and had already pushed this whole adults in little bodies thing, and that didn't change. He just became much more militant about it. And the messengers became his personal messengers. And they were not only to deliver his little messages in writing or verbally, but they were to communicate exactly in the tone or attitude that L. Ron Hubbard expressed when the message was delivered. So if he was mad at somebody, he's, I want you to go down there and I want you to rah, 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 rah at them. Deliver that message exactly. Right? And so here's this 11-year-old who's about to go rip the face off some adult in the engineering room or some adult over in the administrative area because L. Ron Hubbard wanted this guy's or this woman's face ripped off. It's figuratively speaking. It's a term in Scientology for really giving somebody the what for, usually at the top of your voice, right? At the, very, very loudly. You rip into somebody. And Hubbard was teaching 10, 11-year-olds how to do this in his name. And these were his messengers. And they were basically, that was basically the setup there. And that went on for years. These children were raised by L. Ron Hubbard. They were not around their parents very much on these boats. Treating children as immortal adults justified severe disciplinary actions. Children on these boats were treated like adults, and they were given adult discipline. There's a documented account of a 4-year-old who was confined in the chain locker, as we've discussed on this channel a few times. That's the forward part of the boat where the chain that holds the anchor, where that wraps up in that forward part of the ship, is called the chain locker, and you can throw somebody in there as a disciplinary action. It's a dangerous space. You could actually get hurt in there or even die. And if you're a 4-year-old being exiled to the chain locker for days on end, they are very, very, very lucky that that child did not die in that room. And, of course, they were made to walk the plank and do other things, including the RPF, the Rehabilitation Project Force that L. Ron Hubbard and his crew started in the early 1970s on the boat, had children go to it. If children were found on the boat who were supposed to be doing work and they weren't, and they were slacking off, they were discipline problems of some kind or another, and everybody on the boat was a discipline problem of some kind or another at some point. Those kids were treated like adults and put on the RPF, which meant hard physical labor most of the day. That's what the RPF is and was. Well, it's not around anymore, they say. But that's where it started, and the kids were not exempt from it. We come forward to to when the Sea Org went to land. They went off the boats. In 1976, they landed in Clearwater, Florida, and then they had already established Sea Org bases in Los Angeles and at a few other locations around the world. And Clearwater was going to be the central headquarters and central base of operations for Scientology. That's what L. Ron Hubbard decided. But then he got spotted, and he was in hiding from the law. And the FBI raided Scientology's Los Angeles headquarters and Canadian headquarters and other places because Scientology had been engaged in the largest infiltration of the United States government that had ever been carried out then or now by a private entity. And L. Ron Hubbard was not indicted. He was, but there were 11 other Scientologists who were, including L. Ron Hubbard's wife. So a bunch of people went to jail, prison. And during that time, they had come to land and there were kids and people were having kids in the Sea Org. And this was a problem because L. Ron Hubbard didn't set up or allow for children to be children. And he had his messengers, but those weren't all the kids in the Sea Org. There were tons of kids in the Sea Org. And he only had a small number of them that were his own staff. So all these other kids were being either ignored, neglected, or abused. They were considered within the Sea Org a liability and a non-resource. They were found to be drastically behind in school, and there's a document, which we can go over here. from August 1981. And I'm not going to read all of this to you, but there were 339 children in the Los Angeles area Sea Org organizations. Out, not even Clearwater. We're just talking about over in the Los Angeles area by 1981. They've got 339 kids down there. You can see the age distribution here. From 0 to 1 year old, there's 30 of them, all the way up to 17 to 18-year-olds. And according to this evaluation, and I've only snipped bits of it here for you, there is no Cadet Org. A cadet is supposed to be a kid who's basically working inside the organization for Scientology. Hubbard defines it here. But there's no Cadet Org. There's no organization. There's no setup. These kids are being left to wander the streets or wander the base. There's nobody in charge. And they're wondering now in this eval why it is these kids, these neglected, abused kids, are a bunch of juvenile delinquents in Scientology's own estimation of their own kids that they've been 100% in charge of and responsible for all this time. Right? The result of Scientology being in charge of kids is that the kids are neglected and abused and uneducated and uninformed and completely not set up to succeed. So, have any of L. Ron Hubbard's, by 1981, the children who they have the most amount of control over, the most amount of influence over in their entire history, and they, by Scientology's own estimates, these kids are not resources, are not useful, are a burden, and have been neglected and abused. So how could we possibly imagine that L. Ron Hubbard or anyone in his organization actually cares about kids? When, while he was alive to enforce his will, L. Ron Hubbard's will was that these kids be this way. By 1986, it was so bad that they said, we're not having any more kids. That's it. No more. Done. No longer having any kids. You can't stay in the Sea Org and have kids. Right? And so what happens? Well, if you get pregnant, well, you can't leave. You can't leave us. You're just sticking a knife in our back. You're just betraying the group. You're betraying the planet if you leave and have children. So the result, after 1986, 60 to 80% of Sea Org members are having abortions, right? Rather than raising kids. And if they do decide and hold on to their commitment to raise a child, despite the abuse that they suffer, the parents suffer from their fellow Sea Org members who are not okay with them leaving the Sea Org in order to have kids. But if they do, right, they send them, at first, in the 1980s, they shipped them off. They kept them in Scientology by shipping those Sea Org parents off to city-level churches, the Class 5 orgs, and making them staff there. And by this time, in the public level of Scientology, outside of the institutional Scientology Sea Org craziness, there had been public Scientologists who had set up private schools, not church run or even directly church affiliated. They were simply given trademark licensing, okay, and they set up these private Scientology schools, and they were very, very much pay-to-play operations. These were called Delphi schools. And there were other efforts by other Scientologists to create schools or facilities similar to what we see now with the troubled teen industry. Scientology had its brand of that in the 80s, 90s, and up to today, with these Mojave Desert School and Desert Academies, these places out in the desert where supposedly difficult juvenile delinquent Scientology kids could be sent, and Scientology would be used to straighten them out. Well, we've interviewed many survivors of those schools on this channel over the last years, and you can check those out. They were hellholes, and they are, because Scientology has no idea what they're doing when it comes to kids. So here are your basic institutional contradictions with kids over these time periods, right? I barely covered study tech, by the way, in this, but that was another innovation that Hubbard had come up with in the 60s, which Hubbard didn't even come up with. He only said he did. He lied. L. Ron Hubbard was given study tech by the Berners, Ava Berner and her husband, who were kicked out of Scientology for their gift to Hubbard within a year of doing so, because Hubbard couldn't have people like that around who knew that he was a lying McLiarface. And Hubbard had claimed credit for the study tech that he had gotten from the Berners. And this was the business about looking up your misunderstood words and, fiddle-faddling with things to demonstrate stuff and things like that, right? Those basic principles. L. Ron Hubbard didn't come up with any of that. Prior to the lecture that Hubbard gave, I think it was in 1964, on the topic of misunderstood words. Prior to that, Hubbard didn't have anything on words. That wasn't the thing at all. And study was a mishmash of some pretty bizarre practices and creative processing, right? That was what Scientology had to bring to the subject of education and study. So the Berners come along and present Hubbard with this study tech, and he says it's all his own creation. He came up with it himself while he was studying photography, he said. Such a lie. And Scientology has used this study methodology as its way to teach children and adults, anybody, how to learn things. So we have these contradictions just showing you there on the screen. And the study tech strategy, right? Because that study tech, the absence of mass, the steep gradients, the misunderstood words is your basic three things. The mock-up exercises, the attempt to rebrand this in a secular way with books and materials and an organizational front group called Applied Scholastics, which is Scientology's front group for getting study tech out into the world. They think that if they can infiltrate schools, they're not claiming that the schools are full of rapists and sexual assaulters and pedophiles now in order to force Scientology into them. Instead, they're trying a much more, hey, we can help you with this study tech. And that's their current effort to get people into, get Scientology into schools. So, over 70 years, Scientology has defined the child as everything from a fragile recording device to an immortal soldier and finally to an institutional liability. The shifting ontology, the immortal child, reveals an organization guided not by theological consistency, but by an absolute willingness to rewrite its most fundamental truths to ensure its own survival. And that's the deal with Scientology and children. The big kind of overview that I wanted to give you guys today. I'm not sure if we were exhaustive enough in covering everything that had to do with kids in Scientology, but I think we covered an awful lot today. And so I thought y'all probably wanted to know this and should know this, because Scientology's current take on kids is incredibly cynical given its actual history with children. And this idea that they have turned over a new leaf, or they really care about their kids now, or this is how they're now going to take care of their second generation, third generation Scientology kids, is through these new books and courses, and they're going to teach them Scientology and everything's going to be great. We've already seen exactly what happened over the last many generations when Scientology enters into the lives of children. Whether through dianetics, whether through creative processing, whether through institutional private schools, whether through the Sea Organization and actual concentrated Scientology, hardcore Scientology, If Scientology was so good for kids, you'd think that within the Sea organization, they would have the most brilliant, the most able, the most capable children growing into Scientology adults that this planet has ever seen. And if you listen to Scientology's propaganda nonsense, then it would be obvious that that would be how it should be. But that is not the reality at all. The children of the Sea Org have been amongst the most victimized and most abused of anyone who's ever had anything to do with Scientology. So now you know a little bit more about why and Scientology's actual history with it. So I hope that this was entertaining, informative, and educational today. And thank you very much for coming around and watching. And I would ask at the end here, of course, if you like this channel and like the work that I'm doing here, please do support the channel and my work. And I have, by the way, watch the community tab on my channel, because very, very shortly, in fact, probably later today, I will be dropping a link to a landing page where you can sign up for pre-orders on my new book that is coming out. It is dropping April 20th. It is called What Now? A Practical Guide for Life After a Cult. And that will be my second published book, self-publishing it, and it will be followed with an audiobook version and a workshop and more coming from that. So that's just a couple weeks away. So watch for that on the community tab and on my channel here. And otherwise, I will see you guys soon. In fact, I believe I'll see you tomorrow for another live stream about another aspect of Scientology. So, bye-bye, guys.